let's move on to the production cycle. So, as I mentioned earlier, way at the beginning of the presentation here, we really want to get involved as early as possible in game development when it comes to music, because I think it's important to discuss as many styles as you can with the team and what they're looking for and what's going to be appropriate for the game. If you have, for example, if you have a medieval fantasy game, which is like every other game these days, you kind of know what you're getting into, but there may be a certain level of orchestration that you want to work out. Like, how rich do we want the textures to be? Do we want them to be realistic, or are this going to be very abstract within this genre? Okay, there may be a lot of, sure, there are cultural expectations of what's going to play out for the listener, but you can still have some wiggle room in there for different types of musical palette and the arrangement, how many instruments are going to play simultaneously, and so forth. While you're doing that, though, you can set up guidelines, right, and some what I call boundaries, such as the technical requirements. Boundaries being like, how many tracks am I going to be allowed simultaneously to play if we're going to be doing things like vertical orchestration, for example? I need to know. And how much music can I have in the game? An hour, 5 hours, 30 minutes? Where is this stuff going to be placed? Do we want music in the menus? Do we want it in different game modes, in-game, just kind of background stuff? How much music are we talking about here? And we can get a sense early on about what's going to happen. It's going to change. Of course, it's always going to change, but you can at least get it into the ballpark and make some guesses as to how much production time you're actually going to need. And you might want to talk about the technical aspects too. In this case here, talking about file formats. How am I going to be delivering the music? And I say here stream from disk. It could be from hard drive. It could be from any media device. Or is it going to be something that's going to just load right into RAM? Now for the music, if you're going to have these long sweeping passages, 2-3 minute tunes or more, you're going to have to stream it, because there's no way any programmer is going to allow you to load 10 megs per stereo minute, which is what uncompressed full fidelity audio should be, into RAM. It's just not going to happen, even if you have a ton of RAM. It's a very inefficient way to play music, and they could run into all kinds of other performance problems and all this. So what's going to happen is, if you have long playing music, we often stream it. That could be in the form of, say, OGG files or MP3 files, these packets of information, one after the other, that get stitched together as one packet plays. Next one is queued up. The old packet gets removed, the new one comes in and plays, and it has this stitched together seamless experience for you. You don't even know that this is happening, but it's taking up a very small amount of file size. Now, if it's uncompressed, we have to load it into RAM, but those would be the loops I was talking about, those segments, those little cues that we're playing. That's okay. That could be loaded in. As soon as we're done with one, we get rid of it, we bring up the next one, and the transfer rate is, we're talking about nanoseconds here, because it's RAM as opposed to milliseconds, which would be from like a hard drive or a disk. Okay. And as I said here, I just said it a moment ago, WAV files are uncompressed and have the potential for the best quality, but it's 10 meg per stereo minute at full fidelity range of 20 to 20,000 hertz. Okay. And it's going to be loaded into RAM, which is a way too expensive option to take. Okay. And if you got short pieces, we stitch them together and we can put those into RAM. Here I have a kind of a almost dated graphic here, but it still holds together. There are other file formats that exist now, but WAV and AIF being the Mac version of Microsoft Windows WAV file for sound, is an uncompressed format that has full fidelity range, potentially, if it's a 16-bit 44,100 sample per second audio file, and that'll play your high quality audio back. Now, compressed files vary, they're all over the place, MP3s and OGGs, depending on the compression rate. It's a ratio, so it could be an 8-to-1 compression ratio. Now, I'm not talking about our plug-in audio, I mean file format. So it's like a zip file, right? A zip file could have 8-to-1 compression, 16-to-1 compression. Same goes for these. And the deeper level compression, the kind of poorer level of quality you're going to have because you're stripping out a lot of vital information. Particularly that starts at the high end, and then we work our way into the mid frequencies and the lower frequencies. And so the higher the compression file rate of the MP3 or OGG, the typically lower quality audio you're going to have. Now, imagine that you can't have these WAV files in RAM. You can't even have them streaming off the disk, or MP3s rather, on the disk. You have really tight constraints here. Maybe you're making a video game on a watch or something, and you just don't have a lot of CPU or memory. And so we just say, all right, we'll just go with the MIDI file in this case. And this was kind of the go-to thing in the 90s. Everything was a MIDI file, as we saw it in the Dave the Tentacle example way back when from LucasArts. They were streaming voice off of a CD-ROM, and they were playing sound effects from the hard drive, but they were taking the music, the MIDI files, and they were playing it into hardware on a sound card on the PC. And so the MIDI data itself only represents a few bytes, maybe a whole tune might be a few kilobytes or something, as opposed to megabytes with digital audio. So it's a great way to save space. But you're limited by what the instrumentation is. What are you going to be playing for instruments? Is it something that you're loading into a data table of samples in RAM or on a hard drive? It depends. And so it could be a really terrible sounding performance. It all depends on what the playback destination instrument's going to be. Okay. Now, there are tools available to create these sounds for MIDI performances. They used to be called sound fonts back in the day, and you could load them on a disk or in a RAM. And sometimes they're called sound banks. And they can be created by the composer and referenced in real time. You don't see it that often nowadays because, for consoles and PC type games, there's usually plenty of room available to at least play an MP3 or an OGG file. So you don't see the MIDI stuff happening that much anymore. But from time to time, it will pop up. And there are some enthusiasts who swear by it. It's seen just like almost like a competition. Like, how efficient can they be with their sound banks or their sound fonts? Okay. And then you got to think about channels. Now, usually you're just going for stereo. It's no big deal. But sometimes if you have a blockbuster game, perhaps, or something that's maybe a very innovative game, or technically incredible game that's going to have fantastic audio, you're going to have the option of maybe a surround system. That'd be nice, like a 5.1 system. Remember that 0.1 is the subwoofer, the giant speaker there at the bottom right. And it might even be 7.1, okay? You can have with the new consoles that are coming out, like the new Xbox and the PS5, they have an HDMI 2 format that has 32 physical speaker outputs on it if you want. If you have some sort of grand home theater you could set up, that you could do it. But most people who have surround typically have a 5.1 system. Okay, but that may be a special mix you'll have to consider, and then you'll have to downgrade it to stereo in a selection, in a menu selection type of thing. And so oftentimes in a game, I found that surround, and this graphic is true, that you'll have the fancy surround stuff just for the opening cinematics, because it's like this big, Hollywood blockbuster style thing, God of War 4, right? And you've got surround. And then the rest of the game is just playing in stereo. Okay. And mono, you don't really use that much unless you want to have positional music coming out of like an intercom in a building in a game or something like that. Okay. You also need to consider the sample rate and the bit depth, what's called the resolution. You really want to get the best of both of these, okay? You want to have at least 16 bits, and you want to have at least 44,100 samples a second to capture full fidelity audio, our human hearing range. But there's no reason why you can't go any higher than that. You could go up to 48,000 samples, 96,000 samples, 24 bits, 32 bits. But at some point, you're not going to be able to play it back, at least in commercially released game that other people can appreciate. Why we would keep increasing beyond the human hearing spectrum, which is a great question, that many students have asked, is because we're getting closer and closer to that original pure tone, that beautiful, the sine waves I was showing you at the beginning of the class in the lecture 3. We want to get closer and closer to the analog signal, so it's more pure and hopefully a better listening experience. But it's hard to prove whether or not that's true. I mean, if you're playing a game and you've got explosions and lasers and all this stuff happening and pulse pounding music, are you really going to be able to appreciate the difference between 24 bits and 32 bits? Probably not. I would argue that you may have a hard time discerning 16 bits and 24 bits, because once we go past the human hearing range, and we're just talking about getting it closer to a pure analog signal, it becomes more of an esoteric kind of thing, and it's theoretical, and I think at some point your ears just can't appreciate that difference, and especially in some of the more dynamically, vibrant games that are out there. Okay, so if you have handheld devices, or who knows what devices, whatever novel interfaces that may appear in the future that you might have to work on, right? You're going to have severe limitations, and you want to really get the music files knocked down to something small like 22,000 samples a second, or even gasp. I shudder to think 8-bit files, which we used to do on the Nintendo DS. It was pretty bad. It was very noisy. And cell phones, even today, they still, sometimes some of them use the flip phones. They'll use 4-bit audio, which is just gruesome. It shouldn't even be legal, but it happens. And sometimes kids' toys, they have chips that are only, I think it's anywhere from 5 to 12 bits, or some odd number of bits there to play back audio, thinking that, the kid won't mind, but they do. I think they know the difference, and it grates on parents' nerves, trust me. So you could have some device of the future, who knows what it is that you'll be working on, and really you need to know ahead of time what platform it's that you are going to be working on. In some cases, you're going to be working on multiple platforms, especially if it's going to be a widely distributed game, like Marvel Puzzle Quest, for example, a game I worked on, ended up on, it's like PC and Mac and console and Android, iOS, and within iOS, it was a special version just for the iPad. And you have to think about all these platforms and what the limitations are. Unfortunately, again, middleware to the rescue, a program like Wise or Fmod will allow you to stage the mix for all of these different systems. And there's really, thankfully, there's no other really sane way to do it when you're working with so many files, so many assets, and what each system can handle. And there's just a quick little graph of, kind of like what the bandwidth is for certain devices, measured in hertz, right? And the kilohertz, the sampling rate here, 7.4 to 8.192, which is awful, which is really bad squelchy telephone, all the way up to 96,000, which is beyond the Blu-ray DVD audio standard. Okay. And again, you need to know ahead of time what it is you are going to be working on. So before you compose, before you even write your first note of music, you really need to know kind of what's going on out there for other games. And when I'm writing for a game, I try to find the genre. I try to find what the competition is out there. And you remember in lab 1, you're writing an audio assessment. I'll do something like that. And part of that will be the music, right? And so I'm trying to do as much research as I can. In this case, we're talking about music, whatever the styles are. I'll listen to the competition's music in my car. I may listen to just reference music. Maybe it's something like, say I'm doing a historical game here. I do a lot of historical type games, and I used to do a lot of historical city builders. So I would listen to just, not video game competition, but just the actual musicians that are composing this type of stuff for ancient Egypt, or maybe it's Japanese music or medieval music of the Incas, anything. And I just become immersed in it. And my hope is that by listening to it, day in and day out, and I'm really getting into it, I'm excited about it, and I just want to start writing it. Hopefully, there'll be some sort of synergistic thing that happens where unconsciously when I start composing, all the stuff I've been listening to for weeks is starting to come out, the true style of this type of music with a little bit of my own habits, my own style thrown in, because you can't get away from your own style all that much. Even if you try, it's still a little bit of you in there. It's your personality, right? But when it does work, it's really exciting, and it just makes me realize why it's so awesome to be in the video game industry, because you get to do stuff like this, at least from an audio designers or composers perspective.